Something's going on with my slides. I'm not quite sure. But here we are. Not sure what week we're on. We're getting towards the end of the semester. So today I am covering a much more specific topic as opposed to like general adaptations and general training methodologies, and that's altitude training. Altitude training has been around for some time, and it is generally viewed as a very favorable training methodology to improve endurance performance, most notably in endurance runners. So what I'm going to give you guys is I'm going to give you guys a research article to read in addition to these slides. At the end of this PowerPoint presentation, I'm actually going to cover that research article. Much of this information is a combination from both that one research article and chapter 8 of your Daniels text. So as an athlete or coach, we're continuously trying to find new methodologies to improve endurance performance. Unfortunately, some of these methodologies have been borderline illegal, such as performance-enhancing drugs and blood doping, to questionable practices, which is as of late using these new carbon fiber shoes to run faster, to something that's genuinely or generally deemed acceptable, which is altitude training. Altitude training was first observed, or at least improvements were first observed in 1965 by Balke. He's first observed them in 1965, and he saw them in practice at the 1968 Olympics. And what he found is once athletes trained at altitude, they seemed to have this improved endurance performance following returning to sea level. So the first and most important thing is defining what we mean by altitude. To observe any noticeable improvement when returning to sea level, you have to train at approximately 3,000 to 7,000 feet above sea level. Below 3,000 feet, there is not much of a noticeable difference, and above 7,000 feet, while there is a difference in air density, what happens is that difference is a little too much to actually train. And again, these are just general recommendations. Many people have trained at 8,000, 9,000 feet above sea level and still found it to be helpful when returning to sea level. So the general philosophy or mantra within the endurance community is live high, train low. What that means is essentially you should live at altitude and then come down and train at low altitude or sea level. And why is this? It's because you observe the benefits of being at altitude. You don't have to train there. You observe the benefits when you're at 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 feet and just living for a certain period of time. However, when you go to altitude, sometimes you must train at a lesser speed, which can negatively affect performance depending on the person. So what you would want to do in a perfect world is live at altitude when you're not training. You get the benefits, then you come down from altitude, train at sea level where you're able to train at a faster pace and not really affect neuromuscular benefits that happen when you are at high altitude. So what's the physiology, right? What's the mechanisms? Why are we seeing benefits in endurance athletes when training at altitude? Well, what do we see first? And it's pretty clear at this point. There's an improvement in VO2 max, there's an improvement in ventilatory threshold, and there's an overall improvement in performance, right? Athletes run faster when training at altitude and returning to sea level. So why does this happen? The hypoxic conditions at altitude create conditions that produce an adaptation. So what are the hypoxic conditions? The air density, the O2, specifically the oxygen density when you're at altitude is much lower, right? We've all heard this, right? We've seen like movies or I'm thinking of superheroes. As you fly into the atmosphere and you fly really high, right? What happens? They start to lose. They can't breathe. They lose that ability to breathe, and that's because the oxygen density decreases to the point of as you get into space, there is none, right? So these hypoxic conditions at altitude, what happens is it stimulates protein, I always forget how to pronounce that, production, right? Its shorthand is EPO, and I've always said EPO. As EPO is produced, this increases our red blood cell count. As our red blood cell count is increased, we have more hemoglobin. And because we have more hemoglobin, we can carry more O2 within our blood. And then we could transport O2 to the working muscles if you want to take it a step further. So this is very well known at this point. What you'll even see is EPO has been a drug. It's been you can actually inject yourself with EPO, and this has been banned by the IOC as well. So doing it naturally at altitude seems like a natural answer to improve as an athlete. So what happens when you go to altitude? When you initially go to altitude, your ability to perform as a distance or endurance athlete is decreased. And right now I'm talking about runners, right? So what happens when you go to altitude, we already said that the air is less dense. There's less oxygen. If there's less oxygen, naturally, right, your body is going to not be able to perform as well in endurance performance. What you'll see is there is a slight benefit of being at altitude, and because the air is less dense, right, it's less of a resistive force. So we've got like all sorts of forces that slow us down when we're in motion, like gravity and friction, right? So when we're running, believe it or not, we're running and crashing into air molecules, and this is a real thing. Because the air is less dense, you're actually able to run slightly faster, or in this case, more economical. Now, it's a trade-off, right? There's less air, right, which means it hurts VO2, which means there's less oxygen going to your working muscles, but you can run faster. Inevitably, that less air for distance performance kind of outweighs the slight benefit of that more economical running. Now, this is really for distance events. So what do I mean by distance events? Usually the 800 meters and up. 800 meters takes about 1 minute and 40 seconds, give or take, for the elites, 2 minutes for females. So really once you get into like the mile, the 5K, the 10K, half marathon, marathon, that's where distance performance is dramatically decreased at altitude if you have not acclimatized. Conversely, sprint performance is actually increased. And this is because there's not a reliance on the oxidative system for performance. So they don't have to worry about O2 not getting to their working muscles in a 100 or 200 meter dash. Instead, that benefit of the air being less dense far outweighs that, and they're able to improve their performance as opposed to endurance athletes. So what happens is Daniels uses this term acclimatization, and that's simply like exposing yourself to that new stressor continuously and having your body go through that adaptation period. By acclimatizing, right, you may be able to get back to your performances from sea level, but some people still see a decrease in performance. What we have certainly found, right, number 3 is kind of depends. Number 4, right, is that sea level performances may certainly be enhanced because of altitude training when done correctly. So what does altitude training consist of? Right, I've already said we need really a minimum of about 3,000 feet, upwards of about 7,000 feet. And again, I don't want to put a cap on it. There's been plenty of people that train successfully at 8, 9, and 10,000 feet. But what happens is, like I said, once you get above 7,000 feet, there's kind of a trade-off between running a decrement and running speed. You need to be exposed to altitude for approximately 12 hours a day to really receive that benefit. So if you follow that live high, train low, you can't just go up to altitude for a workout and do the opposite. You can't train high for 1 to 2 hours and then live low because you're not exposed to that decreased air density, and you're not going to be in that hypoxic environment long enough. So what happens? Well, there's an approximately a 12 to 16% decrease in VO2 max. However, there's only a 6 to 8% decrease in actual performance in things like time to exhaustion, tests like that. Now, why does that happen? I already told you, right? I said that there's a large drop off in VO2 max because the air is less dense, but in terms of performance, you have to factor in that improved running economy, right? So that improved running economy doesn't quite outweigh that decrease in VO2 max, so the performance decrease is only about 6 to 8% instead of 12 to 16% like VO2 max. What we've also found is that cyclists might actually be able to perform better at altitude, and that's because they are at the higher speeds, right? Just like a sprinter on the track. It's going to improve their performance because they don't have to worry about the air density quite as much. So what changes do you have to make if you're going to altitude in training, right? Well, number one, Daniels recommends that you don't actually alter any of your training volume. So if you're scheduled to run 50 miles per week when you go to altitude, you probably should still stick with 50 miles per week. What he recommends that you do change is actually your training speeds or intensity. Specifically, this is every run type that he categorizes except for your repetition runs, right? So your R runs are your fastest paced runs that Daniels recommends, right? He recommends like 30 to 90 seconds for these runs. And it kind of follows the logic in that those 30 to 90 second runs have a much less reliance on O2 as compared to your E runs. Your easy pace runs might be 60 minutes, 90 minutes, something along those lines, right? So that's why our pace runs, the speed will be the same, but your easy, your marathon, your threshold, your interval, all of those intensities should be adjusted to reflect the change in altitude. To obtain the benefits or to acclimatize, we really look for a minimum of 2 weeks of exposure to the stimulus or stress. So what does that mean? Well, what you'll see in the Olympics is oftentimes you'll have athletes, let's say the Olympics are being held at altitude, right? Oftentimes you'll see athletes head out 3-4 weeks in advance of the actual Olympic Games in order to acclimatize to that high altitude, right? Also, you need 2 weeks to get the benefit, right? So like, let's just say you're a coach and you schedule a runner to actually go altitude train for a certain period of time. 5 days, a weekend doesn't really do it. You're not going to receive the benefit. So if you want to schedule an altitude training block for an athlete, what you would do is you would schedule it as a minimum of 2 weeks. An interesting thing that Daniels put in the text was that you should just view altitude as another stressor, right? And the way I look at it is it's another variable to be periodized or programmed. So, what are the other variables that we periodize or program? Well, you guys know all the basic ones. The velocity, the speed at which people train, the total training volume, the recovery periods, so on and so forth. I think altitude training is really just another tool in the toolkit as a coach. And I do think that, when you're working with high level athletes, it's very much so something you need to consider in the endurance sporting world. Daniels also points out a possible benefit of altitude training being that because you're decreasing the velocity at which you're training on your your easy runs, your marathon runs, what may happen is a not so apparent benefit is that with this decreased velocity, you might actually see a decrease in injury rates or a decrease in overtraining because of that. So some side benefit. All right, so now that we have some basic understanding of what altitude training actually does, and we have a basic understanding of the physiological changes that take place, those are very key, we can start to explore elevation training masks. So, once we started observing the actual improvements with altitude training, we started to say, hey, can we actually get these improvements without actually going to altitude? So in the probably 1990s and definitely in the early 2000s, people started exploring the invention of things like called an altitude tent or an altitude chamber. So they're these super high-tech, very expensive chambers which would actually decrease the total amount of oxygen in the room and create that hypoxic environment, but you don't have to go to altitude to achieve it or receive the benefit. So naturally, these were incredibly expensive, so we need to find a way to simulate this with reducing the cost. So the solution or answer to this was the creation of the elevation training mask. The elevation training mask is worn around the face, obviously, and what it does is it actually blocks, it increases the resistance of breathing, so it blocks air, right? So this makes it more difficult. Now they say it simulates training between 900 and 5,000 meters of altitude, right? So what I've already said is that it blocks O2. So right away, there is kind of a discrepancy between an elevation training mask and actual altitude training, right? And the mask, right, if you look at the problem here, it says it simply blocks the O2. What it does not do, right, what does altitude training do? It actually decreases the density of the oxygen that you are breathing. The mask does not do this. It doesn't decrease the density. It can't affect the oxygen density around us. It could simply affect the amount of oxygen and air that flows into our lungs. Okay, so it's not affecting the density. So because of this kind of discrepancy, this study was conducted, and many others at this point have been conducted, where we're asking, can the mask improve performance, and can it create physiological differences associated with training at altitude? So what did this study look at? Well, the study had 25 moderately trained participants. A key difference here is that they had no cycling experience. Okay. What the participants did is they trained for 6 weeks, twice a week, using a cycle ergometer, and they trained using a 30-minute high-intensity interval training format. There was a control group, so the control group did not wear the mask. Then there was a masked group, which wore the mask for all of their sessions. Gradually, over the course of the 6 weeks, the masked group raised the settings on the mask, making it more and more difficult to breathe. So what were the major findings? Well, the researchers found that both groups significantly improved performance metrics over the course of the 6 weeks, right? What we found is that the control group improved their VO2 max 13.5% and their peak power output 9.9%. The mask group improved 16.5 for VO2 max and peak power output by 13.6. So despite these absolute differences, the masked group was not statistically significantly better than the control group. Right, so if you look at the bottom, the last comment here, it says there's no significant differences between lung function, performance, or I'm just going to say blood lactate levels. Right, so they measured lung function for vital capacity and like how much air they could breathe. They measured performance through average wattage, right? And they measured blood lactate as for the final variable. And there was no significant difference between the masked and non-masked group. There were, however, significant differences between the groups at what we would call ventilatory threshold. So once breathing became labored, right, that was your ventilatory threshold. And what they found was the masked group increased their ventilatory thresholds and their peak power output over the non-masked group. So, kind of what's the take home from this study? I think the major take home is probably from a physiological standpoint, there's no real changes that happen using a elevation training mask. And several other studies at this point have also pointed out to this. When I was finishing my master's, a peer of mine actually did his master's thesis using the elevation training mask, and he found exactly the same thing, and that performance was not improved in one group or the other, but he did also find that ventilatory threshold was improved over the masked group. So if performance isn't improved, what does that mean? Should you use it? The answer is, as an endurance athlete, probably not. Right? We don't really care about our ventilatory thresholds. What we care about is actual performance, time to exhaustion. Can you put out more power? Right? And there was no significant difference between this study and several others at this point. However, I don't want to say that a elevation training mask is completely useless. In my opinion, this is just my opinion, I think the mask can be useful in sports where breathing may be obstructed at certain points or difficult. So what does that mean? So if you're in a triathlon, right, and you're in an open water swim where there's a lot of things going on, elbows are being thrown, there's waves, I think that might be a situation where breathing is obstructed, where maybe in training with an elevation training mask, it might be helpful. Now, I wouldn't say swim with one, but again, it might be helpful. Another situation where improving your ventilatory thresholds and having this kind of obstructed airway. Another thing that might be helpful is training for like combat sports, like MMA, where people getting choked out. Right? It might be helpful to train with that kind of obstructed airway and kind of get used to that when possible. So those are my take-home points. Read the study, take what you want from it. There's plenty of others at it. As always, use more than one study and kind of make your own conclusions.